Hello everyone, greetings from the Servant of Nero, AJ here with a look at a breakdown of the militaries of the various factions and powers of Immoren, with a fair bit of overlap with the game's factions, though in the case of mercenaries and minions there'll be a bit of improvisation to give it some semblance of a pattern. Watch this space as it were. First out the block should not be too much of a surprise given my biases where the nations of Immoren are concerned, and should help set the tone for how these installments are broken down. Some of the content is covered in the game's faction introduction series, so I'll rehash as little bit as possible. But it'll feature more of a history of the armies and historic traditions of certain branches, rather than what the forces themselves currently do, as well as feature branches of the respective armies that aren't portrayed in the tabletop game, and sometimes not even in IKRPG. And because battle groups tend not to be especially common in the lore, even if playing prominent roles in the fluff and being central to the game itself, beasts and jacks won't be detailed pretty much at all, as there'll be something to cover in another series, particularly beasts, the jacks having had their own turn of sorts. The history of the Scorn has been a violent one since the earliest of memories, both by their own reckoning and from what little remains of Lyossan history. From the very first encounters of the Scorn tribes with rural elven settlements in central Immoren, the martial prowess of what my ancestors dubbed a barbaric people could not be denied. With little desire to engage in what anyone might call diplomacy, the Scorn raided Lyossan villages and retreated as the armies from larger cities came to deal with their incursions, dissolving into the deserts of the east. At this time, only the character of the Scorn had been established, and the seeds of what would eventually become the hok-SOON, the Scorn martial philosophy, were long planted, awaiting future events whereupon it would come to the fore. Military traditions were unknown during this tribal era, though effective tactics were known to have gone hand in hand with the might of the individual, and every Scorn commander, at some stage labelled the Tyrant, was adept at both leadership and personal strength of arms. Like other races of Immoren upon whom many sudden changes were forced, the Cataclysm brought change to the Scorn. For once, tribes were compelled to cooperate for their own survival, and it is at this time that a more formal military structure started to crystallize. As they fled towards the safety of the Shroudwall Mountains and the coast of Makeda Lake, many tribes were decimated by the devastation that created the abyss down the middle of the continent, and weakened tyrants submitted to the stronger. And as the Scorn evolved from a nomadic people into a settled one, tribe became house, and so too did a hierarchy of nobility come into being as the stronger tyrants became dominars. And as Scorn culture adapted amidst growing urbanization and reinforced by the establishment of the city of Halark, superseding Malphas as the first city of the Scorn realms, and still standing strong as the Empire's capital even now, strata of society became better and better defined. Ancient grudges among tribes and now houses flared into renewed conflict, and the defeated were treated without mercy as stability had returned to the Scorn people. Weakened houses were fully subsumed by their rivals or overlords, reduced in status without consequence. Such a society became reflected in its armies also, as the legendary Dominar Vuxoris, the first Exalted, formalized the hok-SOON, prizing the thrill and peril of close-quarters combat above all other personal considerations. The hok-SOON was something the Scorn would never be able to step away from, and it quickly became a firmly integrated part of their culture, made even more integral thanks to how so many of the most valued figures in Scorn history are the warrior philosophers, that esteemed class of leader the hok-SOON prized over all others. Armies became composed of two core elements thanks to the hok-SOON. The lower class conscripts were the Venators, given less honourable weapons, most notably the sling and stone, while the Praetorians were the valued military asset of any house with political pretensions. Entry to the ranks of the Praetorians became a highly ritualized affair, with upstart fighters challenging each other to duels to earn praise among those they wished to join, before testing themselves in the arena to finally gain recognition as a Praetorian. Over time, as the forces of respective alliances of Scorn houses waged war against each other, at first around the shores of Makeda Lake, but then to much of the southeast of mainland Immoren, methods and arms evolved as the Praetorians became separated into two distinct forces that came to categorize the elements of known hammer and anvil tactics. The hammer remained as the swordsman, while the anvil was embodied in the spear and shield-equipped Praetorian Carax. Further military evolution and the expansion of the Scorn bestiary saw the hammer's role taken by the lance-wielding Praetorian Ferox riders, while the swordsman became an elite reserve, sent into battle to deal the final blow to secure victory, or in desperation to save an army from defeat. Originally, the Praetorians were separated quite strictly by the house to which they swore fealty, and were officered from within their own number. But in modern times, this tradition was, like many others, discarded by Venator Reivers, otherwise known as the Conqueror, as he prepared his westward invasion. Instead, it is to the standard of the army that most Praetorians give their oath of loyalty, and with such a diverse body of soldiers, it is a singular distinction to become officers among them, much more so than in the past, considering the fierce rivalry among the various houses whose forces contributed to the formation of the army of the Western Reaches. Over time, metallurgical techniques improved, allowing a more widespread upgrade of armour from the lacquered plating as used by the Praetorians, to the superior protection worn by those who had become known as the Cataphracts. Initially, the preserve of the nobility, Cataphract armour was worn by tyrants and their elite guards, who valued it as a symbol of their physical strength since it was, and is, notably heavy, though no less imposing for it. As armourers perfected the techniques in producing it, whole units among the wealthier and more powerful houses could eventually be outfitted with Cataphract armour. Due to the cost of production, weight, and continued rarity, Cataphracts came to be an elite force of heavy infantry among the Scorn. The Praetorians would remain the symbol of traditional Scorn martial culture, however, for while the weapons technology progressed, the arms, armour, and methods of the Praetorians stayed relatively unchanged. The Cataphracts looked to Voxoris himself to find their ultimate heritage, for a proud number among them wield the arcus, which, as legend holds, was the weapon the first Exalted wielded, whether in fighting enemies or taming wild beasts of the desert. Common to both Praetorian and Cataphract, though, is their unity of mind, purpose, and adherence to the hok-SOON. Despite their differences, both corps revel in the grueling training regimen, and the transformation from what would be an ordinary Scorn into a superior warrior, a master of their chosen weapon, and perhaps others besides. They both also hold those of the hastations and the Venators in no small contempt, though in recent years, with the invasion of Western Immoren and the new way of war that it has forced upon the Scorn, along with their wars against the Lyossans, which drove them back across the abyss, they have developed a grudging respect for these nominally lesser soldiers. After all, it was expected for the Venator skirmishers to take no part in the melee, or even flee when defeat appeared likely. And such was the indifference and even disdain that some Scorn tyrants displayed towards them. Many retained them only as a matter of form, or to use them as an expression of contempt for their enemies. These lesser soldiers nominally see little, if any, direct fighting. The hastations are lower caste Scorn with insufficient status to join the ranks of the more storied corps of the soldiers, and some are even disgraced Praetorian tyros, deemed unfit for such ambitions. These more lightly equipped troops form the Garrison forces, guarding fortresses at the fringes of the Skorne Empire or the strongholds of the great houses. It is difficult to say whether they rank above or below the hastations, but the Venators are the ranged forces. Originally slaves in ancient days, given ranged weapons in emergencies as a sign that they were not worthy of being treated as proper warriors by the tenets of the hok-SOON. Simplicity was the byword for the equipment carried by the Venators, and such was their apparent shoddiness they could arrive at battle carrying nothing but their meagre day's rations. A strip of leather and scavenged pebbles could be their weapon, their cheapness serving to reinforce the differences between them and the Praetorians and Cataphracts. Their standing would rise, if only a little, in the years leading up to Archdonima Makeda's assumption of the leadership of House Balash, due to the civil war in which she fought against her brother. Judicious use of Venator forces as a fully integrated part of her limited military assets granted her acclaim, and while she would never go so far as to raise their status to be equal to even Praetorians, they had an honour to call their own. And, perhaps as reward for their generations of thankless service and sacrifices, Venators would be the ones outfitted with the most radical of advancements in Scorn military technology. As to this technology used by the armies of the Scorn, observers might call them parochial, but unlike the cultures of the West, which invented blasting powder during the struggle against the Orgoth, Scorn chemists developed different means to achieve the same effect independently, and this came in two forms. One was the volatile gas, Venhokar, which would eventually be the propellant used in the Reaver, a weapon wielded by Venators in both light and heavy versions, while a small number of Cyclopes also wield the heavy Reaver. Coming much later was a closer analogue of blasting powder, as Supreme Archdonima Makeda recognized the need for additional weapons to maintain the ascendancy on the borders of the Bloodstone Marches. Chemists very quickly came upon a modified combination of deadly materials which went on to serve as propellant and ammunition in the Incindus, the weapon of the Cataphract Incendiarii. The origins of this technology can be found in what was initially applied to the Scorn bestiary in around 400 AR. The more intelligent and dexterous creatures among the Titans were trained to wield medium cannons, exploiting the destructive power of these chemicals to bring a new dimension to siege warfare in the Scorn realms. Able to knock walls down with consummate ease, the Titan cannoneer and its equipment became a prized part of any tyrant's armory. Defensive countermeasures against their cannons in the form of sloped walls became prevalent only recently, just in time for cannoneers to be pressed into Makeda's army of the western reaches, which would spearhead the invasion of the west. Naturally, alongside the rank and file of the Scorn forces are several ancillary branches who have a more direct approach to applying war liturgy on the battlefield, or on campaign. Of utmost cultural and symbolic importance are the Extollers and their charges, the Exalted Immortals, clay and stone constructs animated by the souls of Scorn heroes of generations past, worthy of reverence from even the most lauded Cataphract. Among themselves, the Scorn rarely deign to use these exalted warriors to fight their fellow Scorn, considering it a slight against the memory of the souls who are called upon to fight again to make up for the shortcomings of the living. Many exalted were preserved after a lifetime of fighting rival Scorn, and many tyrants did not consider it hok-SOON to send them to war except in the direst of circumstances. But the war in the west made demands on the forces of the young empire which tested the cohorts fielded by the houses, and there was no doubt among Makeda and her commanders that having the immortal exalted fight humans, elves, trolls and others was hok-SOON. While it is the immense great swords of the immortals who strike the enemy down, it is the efforts and skill of the Extollers that allow them to take form at all. The souls of the fallen are saved from their deceased bodies and preserved in the sacral stones whose method of preparation has been passed through generations of Extollers for a little under 3,000 years. In the absence of Extollers, often their duties fall to the greatest of deceased Scorn heroes, who are brought back to watch over the houses they fought for in life. These ancestral guardians originally rarely fought in battle, but were deployed in the army of the Western Reaches at Vinter the Conqueror's command, and Makeda did not choose to send them back to the Scorn homelands. Instead, the many sacral stones set into the guardians' forms are the sanctuary into which they guide the souls of those who die what may be judged a glorious death in battle. However, more ubiquitous alongside the soldiers of the Empire are the pain-givers, originally formed by the ancient philosopher Morkarsh as a sect whose teachings concerning mortal liturgy were predicated around the understanding of the flow of energy and stimuli about the body. They form a caste who are considered inferior to the warriors of the Praetorians, but no tyrant dismisses the services of the pain-givers lightly, for they maintain a house's bestiary and serve as scouts, intelligence gatherers, and, when the occasion calls for it, assassins and interrogators. As such, the pain-givers are often called upon to use their skills to bring fractious, defeated forces to heel, whether beasts or not, and should they be particularly successful in this endeavour, such vanquished are granted the dubious honour of serving the Scorn, under suitable supervision, of course. The pain-givers, through their knowledge of the biological applications of mortal liturgy, support tyrants in battle, able to direct beasts while specially trained blood runners can move freely around the battlefield, striking when opportune, before fading away again. However, part of a rival philosophy are the Annihilators, stemming from one of Morkarsh's most prominent students, Xarvax, where the pain-givers are masters of knowing how and when to inflict pain on the enemy to elicit maximum suffering. The Annihilators wish to channel their interpretations of mortal liturgical power and the hok-SOON together through personal experience and endurance of self-inflicted pain. Such rituals as they conduct upon themselves bring the warriors of their order to an elevated state of consciousness, allowing them to fight unfettered by all but the worst of injuries. Their zeal is great, perhaps too great, even for a race so martial as the Scorn, so it is not such a surprise that they are few compared to the pain-givers, but they are no less useful on any battlefield. With their recent defeat by the forces of Ios and retreat from western Immoren, time will tell what new developments the armies of the Scorn will undergo. It is a safe assumption, however, that hok-SOON will remain.